You think the Wild West was all about high noon duels and pristine steak dinners by the campfire. But cowboys had mastered techniques for dealing with rotting meat that kept them alive while the bacteria should have killed them. Here's the thing about meat on the frontier that sounds completely backwards. Cooking it fresh when you're miles from civilization will actually starve you faster than eating it decayed. Yeah, you heard that right. The prairie is literally a giant oven everywhere around you. But throwing a fresh slab of beef onto a skillet makes your digestive system panic and start shutting down. The bacterial load in prairie meat is about 10 times higher than what your modern stomach can handle. When you eat it fresh without the right preparation, your body desperately tries to purge those foreign microbes by flushing your system, leading to dysentery so severe it was often called the bloody flux. You end up losing more nutrients than you gained. It's like trying to fuel a steam engine with wet gunpowder. Cowboys figured this out the hard way during those brutal cattle drives across Texas and Kansas. Chuck wagons back then were basically rolling wooden cupboards with absolutely zero temperature control. Fresh beef turned into a biological weapon within hours, and trail bosses had to choose between carrying massive amounts of salt, which was heavy and expensive, or finding ways to make the meat edible after it had already started to turn. Most chose the latter, thinking they could just cook the sickness out of it later. Bad choice. Greenhorns would watch their dinner supplies turn different colors day after day. Desperate drovers would sneak bites of undercooked steer when the cook wasn't looking, only to become violently ill within hours. Their stomachs would cramp up. They'd get severe fevers, and their minds would start playing tricks on them due to the toxins entering their bloodstream. Some cowboys reported seeing stampedes that weren't there, or ghost riders on the horizon. The smart trail bosses quickly learned that food poisoning could destroy a drive faster than any band of rustlers or Comanche raiding party. Stories spread through every saloon about camps found with the fires burned out, the men dead from ptomaine poisoning while surrounded by seemingly endless supplies of beef. These weren't just scary tales, they were warnings. A digestively safe meal became more valuable than a saddlebag full of gold dust. Seriously, cooks would guard their meat supplies like bank vaults, because that's exactly what they were. When the beef ran low or went too high, that's polite cowboy talk for rotting, even the most loyal hands would turn violent. Knifings started over dinner portions more often than over card games. The legendary Charles Goodnight himself once implied his biggest fear wasn't a stampede, but running out of edible protein with 3 weeks of dessert left to cross. Smart cowboys realized they needed to become microbiology experts without even knowing what a microbe was, or risk watching their friends die of flux in the middle of nowhere. The irony was perfect and deadly. Cowboys spent their lives herding thousands of pounds of fresh meat on the hoof, but the food on their own plates was often gray, fuzzy, and smelled like death. Beef meant survival, and survival meant figuring out how to eat the inedible. But here's where cowboys got creative. They started developing tricks that would make modern food safety inspectors faint on the spot. After learning that fresh meat in the heat was basically a bacterial time bomb, cowboys had to act fast. Their first instinct? Coat everything in enough salt to bury a horse, but they couldn't just stand there dumping precious minerals like confused miners. Smart cooks rigged up elaborate drying racks using whatever they had. Wagons and rope lines became giant dehydrators, stretched tight across the camp. The trick was positioning everything just right so the wind would wick away moisture, turning the meat into jerky instead of letting it fester uselessly in the stagnant air of a saddlebag. Makes sense, right? Here's where it gets interesting, though. Cowboys quickly discovered that using raw meat for jerky was like trying to chew through a boot that had been soaking in a swamp for weeks. Gross. So they developed a prep routine, slicing the meat dangerously thin with razor-sharp Bowie knives before any drying attempt. This meant precious time and energy spent on preparation, but it was worth avoiding that nasty texture of rot. Then there were the fly blows. Cowboys became surprisingly good at improvised pest control, creating barriers from cheesecloth or just heavy layers of black pepper. These makeshift shields prevented blowflies from laying eggs, which would turn into maggots, directly onto the drying strips. Some cooks got so good at this they could preserve hundreds of pounds of beef during a single drive. But wait, it gets weirder. When the sun wasn't enough, desperate cowboys turned to smoking on the move. They'd hang meat strips inside the wagon canvas or directly over the nightly campfire, leaving them exposed to the thick, acrid wood smoke. The amount of smoke flavor was intense, maybe enough to make a modern person gag. But every layer of soot counted when you were trying to kill surface bacteria. The real problem with all these methods: nature doesn't follow a cattle drive schedule. The weather could turn humid and rainy for weeks, making dehydration impossible. Jerky production worked better in the arid Arizona deserts than the humid swamps of Louisiana, depending on the air pressure and moisture content. Well, clever cooks started combining techniques. They'd set up permanent smoking riggings on the back of the chuck wagon, while also rotating salt-curing duties among the crew. The most successful outfits treated meat preservation like a military operation. Everyone had specific jobs, from the butcher to the smoker, and slacking off could mean food poisoning for the whole outfit. And the weird part is, these early methods actually worked pretty well when conditions were right. Cowboys could make enough jerky during a dry spell to last several weeks, but relying entirely on the weather meant gambling with everyone's intestines. Unfortunately, Mother Nature wasn't always cooperative, which forced cowboys to look for more reliable solutions. They needed something that didn't depend on the sun or the wind, something they could control themselves, even when the humidity stayed stubbornly high for weeks. Cowboys might have thought they solved their meat problems once they dried it. But storing the stuff? That was a nightmare wrapped in canvas and sealed with false hope. Every chuck wagon carried barrels or boxes for supplies, but these weren't your sterile Tupperware containers. We're talking about wooden crates that absorbed grease and blood, becoming breeding grounds for microscopic killers. But here's where things got disgusting fast. Meat sitting in these hot, airless boxes didn't just stay preserved for long. The fat would start rancidifying from the outside in. This turned your precious protein supply into a slimy, foul-smelling mess that tasted like someone mixed candle wax with old pennies. Bacteria absolutely loved these dark, greasy wooden homes and threw parties that would make your stomach turn inside out. Then there's the flavor problem nobody talks about. These boxes weren't brand new. They'd been used for storing everything from horseshoes to kerosene. Your jerky would pick up hints of whatever lived in that wood before. One day you're eating beef that tastes like axle grease. The next it's got notes of moldy flour. Makes sense, right? Wood absorbs everything like a thirsty sponge. Cowboys discovered the hard way that their carefully dried meat would turn into a toxic hazard within days, sometimes hours in the humid Texas heat. The irony was brutal. You could starve to death while sitting on a wagon full of meat that would make you sicker than eating a rattlesnake raw. Well, desperate times called for desperate measures. Cowboys weren't exactly known for giving up easily, especially when their lives depended on it. They started experimenting, trying anything that might keep their food from turning into a science experiment gone wrong. Some cooks tried burying the meat in barrels of flour or cornmeal, hoping it would absorb the moisture and insulate the flesh from the heat. Others rotated their stock, constantly moving meat between the center of the pile and the outside to prevent any one piece from getting too hot. But these were just temporary fixes for a problem that demanded real solutions. And the weird part is, the answer was literally staring them in the face every time they made breakfast. The solution involved acid, heat, and a technique that would accidentally revolutionize how we think about stews today. Cowboys were about to become accidental scientists, and their next discovery would change everything about trail cooking forever. Cowboys weren't exactly known for their scientific breakthroughs, but desperate times called for desperate measures. When your crew was starving and your meat smelled like a decaying carcass, you get creative fast. Here's where things get interesting. Some clever cook figured out that acid could actually wash the rot off the meat. They started deliberately washing their green, slimy beef with vinegar before throwing it in the pot. Sounds crazy? Well, this souring trick was pure genius disguised as a culinary crime. The process was simple, but brilliant. Cowboys would take a slab of beef that had developed a slick, rainbow-colored sheen of slime, Pseudomonas bacteria, and scrub it violently with a vinegar-soaked rag. They'd stop before the meat disintegrated, leaving behind a surface that was chemically altered. Then they'd brown this vinegar-washed meat in scorching hot tallow and wait for the magic to happen. And the weird part is, it actually worked. That acetic acid wash wasn't just seasoning, it acted like a chemical peel for the steak. The acid killed the surface bacteria and neutralized some of the toxins that made the meat smell like a dead skunk. Think of it as the Wild West's first chemical disinfectant system, invented by guys who rarely bathed. Cowboys noticed their vinegar-treated stew didn't kill them as often. Instead of getting the shakes and the sweats after dinner, they could keep working. This washed meat could be eaten days after it should have been thrown to the buzzards without becoming completely disgusting. The acid didn't just kill bad stuff, it actually tenderized the tough, dried-out muscle fibers that made trail beef so hard to chew. What makes this even more amazing is that cowboys accidentally stumbled onto something we still use today. Modern chefs use marinades for similar reasons, to break down fibers and inhibit bacterial growth. Cowboys weren't trying to make gourmet sauerbraten, they just wanted dinner that wouldn't kill them. The vinegar method spread quickly among outfit cooks because it actually saved lives. Word travels fast when you find something that keeps your crew from dying of dysentery or starvation. Trail bosses started ordering their cooks to stock gallons of vinegar before long drives. But even this clever trick had limitations. Vinegar-washed meat still couldn't perform miracles with truly putrefied flesh, and the process used up precious liquid supplies. Cowboys needed backup plans when the vinegar ran out. Then there's something even more surprising that cowboys discovered about keeping meat edible. They found that adding certain trash parts of the animal to their pots created results that seemed impossible to believe. While cowboys were busy scrubbing their steaks and cursing the flies, some clever cooks discovered something fascinating. Tossing the internal organs, the heart, the liver, even the brains, into the stew pot wasn't just waste reduction. It was nutritional genius. These awful parts weren't there for flavor. They were there for survival. Here's what happened. Cowboys noticed that men who ate the Sonofabitch Stew yes, that's the actual name, stayed healthier longer. The stew didn't turn men pale and weak like a diet of pure muscle meat did. Makes sense, right? Well, cowboys didn't know they were dealing with nature's most potent vitamin supplements. Organs are packed with vitamins A, B12, and iron, things completely missing from hardtack and dried muscle. Modern science proves this works because these micronutrients boost the immune system, helping the body fight off the bacteria present in the slightly spoiled meat. Cowboys stumbled onto this decades before anyone knew what a vitamin was. They just knew their gums didn't bleed, and their night vision was better when they ate the guts. But here's the weird part. Some crews swore the organ stew tasted better too. Richer. Less like eating boiled shoe leather mixed with dust. Cowboys would argue over which organs made the best thickener. The marrow gut, a tube connecting the stomachs, was a delicacy, containing a substance that curdled and thickened the stew like cream. The really smart cooks hoarded these organs specifically for the long haul. When the flour ran low, they'd use the brains to thicken the gravy. It sounds like a horror movie, but on the trail, it was fine dining. Real treasure meant staying alive long enough to spend your wages in Abilene. Then there's the practical side. Organs were the first thing to spoil, so eating them immediately was efficient. Unlike muscle meat that could be jerked, you couldn't dry a liver very well. Cowboys could butcher a steer, throw the organs in the pot that night, and save the muscle for the jerky lines. Recycling at its finest. Modern nutritionists still praise organ meats for the same density of nutrients. Survival experts today know that if you're lost in the wild, the liver saves you, not the steak. Those desperate cowboys accidentally discovered something that high-end restaurants charge a fortune for today. Not bad for guys who thought vegetables were essentially poison. Of course, the stew wasn't perfect. It couldn't fix meat that was already crawling with maggots. It worked best as a constant, rolling boil. Prevention, not cure. Smart cowboys learned to keep the perpetual stew simmering. They never emptied the pot, just added new meat and water, keeping the temperature high enough to kill new bacteria constantly. The stew trick spread through cattle outfits faster than a prairie fire. Captains who ignored this method often found themselves dealing with crews suffering from scurvy and malnutrition, unable to sit in a saddle. But even the Sonofabitch Stew had its limitations when the firewood ran out, and keeping a fire going the 24/7 became impossible. That's when cowboys needed something more dramatic than vinegar and brains. While vinegar washes and organ stews help keep the hunger at bay, cowboys still faced their biggest nightmare, being surrounded by miles of scorching plains with meat that was actively trying to walk away on its own maggots. That's when the craftiest cooks turned to what sounds like pure magic, turning deadly, rotten meat into a crispy, edible staple through surprisingly advanced processes. The process called rendering wasn't new, but cowboys had to get creative with trail materials. Cook the meat in its own fat until every drop of water evaporates, and boom, bacteria can't grow. Simple in theory, absolutely brutal in practice when you're rocking on a wagon with limited fuel. Charles Goodnight, one of the most famous cattlemen ever, actually ordered special possum belly compartments built under his wagons to store buffalo chips for fuel. His crew thought he was crazy until they realized this contraption could save their lives during those endless weeks on the treeless plains. The setup used dried manure to create a steady, low-heat fire that could render fat without burning it. But here's where it gets interesting and dangerous. These rendering operations needed constant attention because one wrong move could start a grease fire, that would burn the wagon down. Cowboys had to balance keeping the fat hot enough to kill the microbes while not burning down their only source of food and transport. Talk about high-stakes cooking. The fuel problem was massive, too. Every buffalo chip burned for rendering was one less chip for warmth or boiling coffee. Some crews got so desperate they started burning dried cactus stalks, spare lumber, even old saddles, anything that would generate heat. The smell must have been absolutely terrible. Then, there's the texture issue nobody talks about. This potted meat produced a product that was incredibly dense. We're talking about meat encased in a solid block of white tallow. A hungry crew of 12 cowboys needed pounds of this stuff daily just to keep the calories up. Smart cowboys learned to time their rendering perfectly. They'd fire up the kettles after a steer was slaughtered, using the fresh animal fat immediately before it could go rancid. Some crews even took turns staying awake all night to keep the process running continuously. The cauldrons they used often came from cut-down barrels or heavy cast iron procured from trading posts. Ironic that their heavy equipment literally became their lifeline. Cowboys discovered that properly rendered meat worked better than jerky because the fat layer sealed out the air completely. Of course, rendering wasn't their only trick. When fuel ran low or rain made fires impossible, cowboys had to get even more creative with their survival methods. While vinegar and fat sealing were clever solutions, cowboys didn't stop there. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and some crews got downright creative with their preservation tricks. The most popular backup plan: adding gunpowder to their meat rub. Now, this wasn't about blowing up their dinner, though that would have been a spectacle. Cowboys discovered that the saltpeter, potassium nitrate, in black powder actually cured the meat and gave it a pinkish color, keeping it from turning gray and death-like. The nitrates acted like a preservative, keeping their precious protein supply edible for longer stretches on the trail. Smart, right? But gunpowder wasn't the only weapon in their arsenal. Some crews swore by burying their meat in charcoal or wood ash. The ash's alkaline bite didn't just mask the horrible taste of the spoilage. It actually changed the pH of the meat's surface. This created a hostile environment for bacteria, effectively searing the meat chemically without heat. Cowboys would also rub brown sugar or molasses into the meat when they could get it. The sugar drew water out of the bacterial cells, dehydrating them until they died. It was a sweet way to fight a savory death. Some cooks got so good at this they could keep a side of beef edible for a week in 100-degree heat. But wait, it gets weirder. When regular methods failed, desperate cowboys turned to high meat, eating it anyway. They conditioned their bodies. They noticed that if they slowly introduced slightly off meat to their diet, their stomachs toughened up. It's the cast iron stomach theory. They built a tolerance to the bacteria that would kill a city dweller in hours. The weirdest concoction had to be what some drovers called six-shooter coffee. This bizarre habit involved dropping a piece of hot charcoal directly into the coffee pot, along with the questionable meat water. The charcoal absorbed the toxins and impurities, acting like a primitive Brita filter in a tin cup. Anything to make their hydration situation more bearable. It probably tasted awful, like drinking liquid campfire, but it was better than dying of the flux. Of course, not every experiment ended well. Some cowboys tried using embalmed beef, canned meat sold by corrupt suppliers that was preserved with formaldehyde. They thought the chemical smell meant it was extra clean. What they didn't know was that the formaldehyde was slowly destroying their livers and kidneys. Cowboys would get weak, jaundiced, and delirious without understanding why their preserved rations were actually killing them. The trial and error approach cost lives, but it also led to genuine discoveries. Cowboys were basically leather-clad scientists, testing wild theories about food preservation while fighting for survival on the open range. While these makeshift solutions kept many crews alive, the most innovative cowboys were already working on something far more ambitious. Some trail bosses were experimenting with techniques that went way beyond simple curing and masking. Methods that could actually transform the very structure of the meat. When regular curing wasn't cutting it, cowboys got creative with the local flora. These tough plants made perfect tools for smoking meat without a fire. They'd wrap the meat in sagebrush or heavy leaves, which contained natural oils that repelled insects. They'd layer the meat with aromatic herbs, tying it into tight bundles. The strong oils from the plants would seep into the flesh, creating a barrier against flies and masking the smell of decay. Cowboys could then hang these bundles under the wagon, letting the airflow do the rest. The result was a heavily seasoned, semi-dried meat that could survive the journey. And the weird part is what happened when they reached the Northern Territories. Cowboys developed emergency cooling techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated. They'd dig coolers into the riverbanks, deep holes lined with wet rocks and covered with wet blankets. The evaporation from the wet blankets drew heat away from the hole, creating a temperature drop of 20 degrees or more. It wasn't a refrigerator, but it was enough to buy them a few extra days of freshness. Some crews even built wind tunnels, using canvas chutes to direct air over the hanging meat, maximizing the cooling power of the breeze. These advanced methods separated the amateur outfits from the true survival experts. While city folks worried about the freshness of their milk, seasoned cowboys were mastering thermodynamics and botany without even knowing it. They turned their wagons into mobile laboratories where every meal was an experiment in survival. The most successful outfits weren't just good at roping. They were brilliant at staying alive through innovation, determination, and some seriously clever meat wizardry. They proved that you don't need a degree to understand survival science. You just need a sharp knife, a lot of salt, and the guts to eat something that would make a buzzard think twice. So next time you look at a steak, remember the cowboys who ate the green, slimy, gunpowder-cured version so that the West could be won. They didn't just survive the frontier, they digested it.